They say art preserves the living, but no one warns you that preservation smells like burning bone. I remember the first time I touched the ashes. Light, soft, still warm. She had been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's melody. And in my hands, she became texture, grain, permanence. I told myself I was honoring her, that clay is honest, that beauty outlives flesh. But when her husband cried as I unveiled the sculpture, I saw myself in the reflection. A man stealing pain and calling it art. Paris applauded, galleries whispered my name like prayer, and every statue sold faster, every story darker. People called it genius. I called it devotion. Now, years later, I can still feel the heat in the marble, a pulse that isn't mine. And sometimes, at night, I swear they breathe. They call me Émile because it sounds softer than what I do. In the registry, it's Émile Lemaire, born in Limoges where porcelain had its own weather, the kilns making a small sun in winter, the dust settling like fog in summer. My mother worked glazes at a factory that smelled of vinegar and heat. My father drove a van that delivered bowls to restaurants he couldn't afford. I grew up on edges, the edge of a kiln, the edge of a paycheck, the edge of a city that never looked straight at us. Clay was the first thing that didn't look away. I learned discipline from burn marks. If you touch a kiln too soon, you learn the measure of patience in an instant. If you overknead, the vessel cracks where your hands tried to control it. The teachers said I had tactile intelligence, a compliment that sounded like a diagnosis. I preferred silence to praise. Silence had rhythm. Silence let the material speak. Paris was a dare. I arrived with a box of tools, a head for proportions, and hands that didn't know fear yet. The city loves an origin that looks like hunger. It can sell that. I rented a damp studio under the tracks at La Chapelle, where the trains stitched the air, where the light came in like an apology. I worked in terracotta and plaster, then stone, then bronze when a grant let me touch its stubbornness. I told myself, earn the right to marble. Marble doesn't like beginners. Personality, if we must call it that, was a blend I didn't choose. Attentive, clinical, patient, unkind to mistakes. I notice everything. The way grief sits in the shoulders, not the eyes. The way happiness moves the throat first, then the mouth. People assumed I was gentle because I worked quietly. Gentleness is not the same as mercy. I could be generous with time, cruel with standards. If you modeled for me and blinked too often, I repositioned your chin without asking. If the gallery wanted a lighter subject, I brought them gravity wrapped in silk. I believed in beauty the way some believe in confession, not to soothe, but to strip. Before ashes, there were bodies. Not nakedness, which is public in Paris if you know where to look, but weight. I carved weight. The mathematician's widow, the retired dancer, the butcher with the ruined wrist. Each brought a story and left with a silence shaped like themselves. My first small success came from a series I called L'arrachement, the tearing away. Figures caught in the instant the soul imagines leaving. Galleries said the work felt spiritual. I corrected them. It's anatomical. They laughed, but I wasn't joking. I had faith in tendons. I kept a ledger of flaws. Not the marbles, mine. Pride that dressed as precision. Envy disguised as admiration when I walked past a rival's show. a tenderness that melted into opportunism around grief, a hunger for permanence that made me suspicious of living things. I was steady, sober, devoted to the craft, yes, but when someone cried in the studio, a small part of me leaned toward the sound, listening for form. The first urn came to me by accident, or fate if you need that word to sleep. A patron named Delphine, hair like chalk dust, eyes like a question left unanswered, arrived with a velvet box. Her husband had died, a conductor. His photograph showed thin wrists and a mouth that had learned to refuse sugar. She wanted him kept, not in a frame, not in a stone with his name, but in a gesture. He had a way of lifting his hand for silence, she said, raising her own. If I could touch that again, I could sleep. She spoke as if sleep were a country you could cross into with papers and a proper handshake. I was going to say no. I felt the refusal rising, clean and righteous. Art belongs to the living, I would have said. The dead are not material. Then Delphine set the box on my table, and it made a sound. Not heavy, not light. Something in between. The sound of what you can carry too easily. I asked to see inside. She opened it. Ashes do not look like we imagine. They are not cinematic. They are fine, familiar, gray. Clay recognizes them. I could honor him. I could dishonor everything. Maybe both. I tested a spoonful in a small slab just to see. It blended the way salt disappears in soup. The surface changed, subtly. Not smoother, not rougher. More awake. The clay remembered each touch longer, as if the body of the man had given it a second memory. I told myself it was chemical. I told myself many things. What is the ethics? I asked my mentor, an elderly sculptor who considered rules decorative. He shrugged. All material has a story. Some stories are louder. He sipped his tea. If you listen properly, that is respect. He didn't ask whose ashes. He didn't ask if I was prepared to become the kind of artist people visit after hospitals and cemeteries. He looked at my hands. They'll shake more, he said. Hold them anyway. I prepared the mix with ritual quiet. Not reverence exactly, but attention. Clay, water, ash, knead, breathe. A small cloud rose and settled on my wrists. It felt like winter. I made a mold of a hand lifted midway. Not command, not surrender. The conductor's hand listening for silence. I worked slowly, then faster, chasing a permission I had not asked for. When the piece dried, the surface held an unusual warmth when the afternoon light touched it. I told myself, physics. I told myself, sunlight absorbed by a slightly different particulate. I told myself, do not romanticize. The unveiling happened in my studio. No champagne, no lighting plan, no curated grief. Delphine stood before the sculpture and raised her hand again, as if to answer it. She touched the fingers. It's warm, she said, surprised, almost embarrassed. I reached out too. It was. Not like skin, not like stone after sun. A steady warmth, the kind you feel when something belonged to a person long enough to remember them. The silence between us thickened into a word neither of us could pronounce. After she left, I sat on the floor, back against the wall, hands in my lap, like strangers waiting to be introduced. Pride moved first. like a cat that thinks it owns you. Then fear, quieter, wearing my voice. I had stepped over a line my teachers pretended didn't exist. Or maybe there is no line, only the courage or vanity to name what we're doing. I told myself rules, only with consent, always minimal incorporation, always purpose greater than novelty. I wrote them on the wall. I believed them the way a thief believes he is only borrowing. The gallery saw the piece a week later and started inventing sentences that had never been said in that room. Unprecedented intimacy, ethical sublime, collectible mourning. I listened with a craftsman's patience and an orphan's hunger. In private, I refined the method. Ratios, drying times, the behavior of ash under low fire versus high, the language to hide the practice from people who could not understand. I justified each decision in the tight arithmetic of ambition. This will allow a widow to sleep. This will honor a father. This will turn sorrow into a shape that can be held without breaking. Each line correct on its own, together forming a lie I could live inside. At night, I lay awake and heard the trains above the studio stitch the city back together. I told myself I was mending something too. I told myself the dead wanted to stay. The truth was simpler. I wanted to be necessary. People will come. They will bring their warm boxes. They will ask me to transubstantiate. Some mornings, I put my ear to finished clay the way a child listens to a seashell. Of course, there was nothing to hear, but the gesture calmed me, framed my arrogance as tenderness. In my head, I kept a museum of moments when art had justified itself to me. A broken arm mended by a potter teaching me the patience of drying. My mother's laugh in a room where we had not eaten enough, but the bowl she held caught light like a secret feast. I added a new room to that museum, Delphine's touch, and the warmth neither of us expected. Ambition relies on a simple prayer, let me matter. Mine wore a white apron and washed its hands often. It smiled at funerals. It told me I was saving something no one else could save. It never said from what or for whom. I didn't ask. I liked the shape of the word forever in my mouth. The first article called me the maker of shadows. The phrase annoyed me. Shadows are what is left when light decides to speak. But it sold tickets to the studio visit. People wanted shadows they could keep. I was ready to supply them. I told myself, keep the rules on the wall. I told myself, keep your hands steady. I told myself, keep the warmth out of your heart. It was already there. Paris is a city that eats its own dead and calls it nostalgia. By the time the conductor's hand was displayed in the gallery, I had become the newest course on its menu. The critics were kind, the collectors quicker. I told myself I was giving form to memory, but memory had become an economy. The orders multiplied like confessions. Each request came with its own theology. A widow wanted a husband's eyes in relief, not portrait. A mother brought a small urn and said, "He was only 5. Make him look like he's sleeping." A young woman, dry-eyed, left a note. "Mix it all, but make it look alive." At first, I asked questions about meaning, consent, boundaries. Then I stopped. The grief was eloquent enough, the payments even more persuasive. Money arrived clean. Ashes arrived in silk. I kept them separate at first. Then the ledger started to blur. The studio filled with sealed boxes, and each had a story too heavy to lift alone. I began to call them by letters, A, B, C, to keep my own conscience alphabetized. I told myself art had always consumed the body. Painters grinding bone for pigment, violin bows strung with horsehair, cathedrals built from stolen marble. Why should my clay be holier? If beauty demanded a cost, I was only collecting what the world already owed. Every piece drew a crowd. Cameras lingered, journalists whispered revolutionary materiality. They wrote of the fusion of mortality and art. No one asked what that fusion smelled like when fired. At night, I washed my hands until the water ran cold. It never came clean. The first magazine profile called me the sculptor of eternity. They photographed my palms. The caption read, "These hands hold time." I smiled. I let them believe it, but I knew what they really held, and how warm it was. Exhibitions followed, London, Milan, New York. The further the cities, the more invisible the ashes. I traveled light, one suitcase, one secret. Galleries dimmed lights to dramatize the glow of my work. They didn't know that glow was not reflection, it was residue. Collectors fought over commissions. The market adored grief when framed in marble and gold. I learned to give interviews about transcending death, about emotional permanence, about turning pain into texture. Every sentence rehearsed like a benediction. There was always applause, and applause has a temperature. It burns just slow enough to mistake for warmth. Delphine returned one evening after my third solo show. She looked older, but her eyes were clearer. "Do you still feel them?" she asked. I wanted to say no, but my silence answered. She nodded once, like someone confirming a diagnosis. "You gave me peace," she said. Then, after a pause that sounded like forgiveness, "But you took yours." The studio changed shape. Assistants now, young, reverent, obedient. They didn't ask what went into the mix. They only followed the ratios. I told them it was heritage dust. A poetic lie is easier to repeat. There were nights I wandered to the Seine, the smell of clay still on my clothes. Paris at midnight has its own kiln, the glow of bridges, the slow burn of neon and regret. I thought of my parents in Limoges, their hands clean, their work humble. They made porcelain for use, not worship. They would have called what I did blasphemy, but quietly, so the neighbors wouldn't hear. My ambition had matured into arrogance, a belief that only I could make beauty honest, because I dared to make it unholy. That's when I met Clémence, an art dealer with a collector's patience and a sinner's smile. She loved the pieces before she loved me. She said I sculpted what God forgot to finish. Her words had the precision of tools, sharp, necessary, seductive. We began to spend nights together, surrounded by half-dried statues. She liked to trace the surfaces with her fingers, then mine. One night she whispered, "It feels alive." I laughed too quickly. "So do I," she added, kissing the dust from my wrist. Desire, like clay, only needs one touch to take form. Commissions turned darker. People wanted parts, not wholes. Hands clasped, faces half screaming, torsos suspended in gesture. Grief was trending. I started blending more ash than clay. The sculptures became lighter, almost fragile, as if the material itself protested its resurrection. The heat of the kiln had to be lowered, adjusted, coaxed like a reluctant soul. Each firing was a ritual, each unveiling a sin rehearsed in daylight. When the first sculpture cracked, I should have stopped. Instead, I saw beauty in the fracture, as if the material finally confessed. I began to keep the shards. Clémence warned me, "You're starting to sound like a priest of the kiln." Maybe I was. Creation had become liturgy. Every firing, a sermon. Every sale, an absolution. The critics adored the decaying purity. They didn't realize it was me that was decaying. Then came the commission that changed everything. A man named Arnaud de Villefort, oil magnate, philanthropist, collector of human sorrow, visited my studio. His wife had died suddenly. He wanted a full sculpture, her seated form, hands on lap, serene. He placed a pouch on my table. "Everything you need is in there," he said. It was heavier than any before. He added, "She loved your work. She used to say your statues breathe." Then, leaning closer, "Make her breathe again." That night, I opened the pouch. The ashes were faintly pink, a sign of higher temperature at cremation. The scent was faint but familiar, mineral, faintly sweet. I mixed slowly, deliberately, with trembling care. For the first time, I whispered an apology before sculpting. Not to her, to myself. I knew what I was giving away this time wasn't clay, but something deeper. The last line between reverence and desecration. As I molded her face, I felt the warmth returning. That impossible warmth. The air thickened, the studio lights flickered. The clay seemed to exhale. My hands hesitated. I wanted to stop, to confess. But the form was already taking shape. Art doesn't wait for repentance. When Arnaud returned weeks later for the unveiling, he didn't cry. He only touched her cheek and whispered, "She's here." I stood behind him, silent. The statue's eyes seemed moist. Condensation, I told myself, from humidity. But the air was dry. That night, I dreamed of the kiln glowing white, and in the fire, shapes breathing, whispering through heat. We were beautiful. You made us remember. I woke drenched, hands burning, the smell of ash in my hair. I was famous now, but every applause carried a frequency only I could hear. Faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat under stone. And somewhere in that rhythm, I began to hear my own name, spoken in the language of the dead. It began with the smell. Clay, dust, and a faint sweetness like burnt sugar. Grief distilled into perfume. I started to crave it. The scent meant creation. It meant something was still willing to be touched by my hands. I stopped wearing gloves. The ash clung better without them. I told myself it was a matter of precision. The artist must feel the texture. But in truth, I liked how it lingered on my skin, even after washing. Like guilt that refused to fade. Each sculpture became more daring. A hand still reaching, a mouth half open, ribs visible beneath translucent glaze. People called it the resurrection of form. They didn't see what I saw. The clay shivering when I breathed too close, as if it recognized me. The kiln no longer frightened me. I opened its door early sometimes just to watch the glow. Inside, I thought I heard whispers. Maybe it was gas flow, maybe something else. The first time it said my name, I laughed. The second time, I answered. Paris in winter has a silence that can kill or cure. That night, both. I had been working late on a private commission, a pair of lovers who died in a car crash. The family wanted them embracing but modestly. I didn't know what modesty meant when love has already burned. The studio was cold, except for the furnace. I turned on a small lamp. The air shimmered above the clay. Then, for the first time, I saw it. A pulse beneath the surface. Just a tremor, but unmistakable. My breath caught. The furnace hummed. The pulse continued. Faint, rhythmic. I pressed my hand against the chest of the statue. Warm. Not possible, I whispered. I stepped back. The clay exhaled. No sound, only a slight release, like dust sighing. The air thickened. I could taste iron. I felt dizzy. I told myself, sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide, fatigue, imagination. But when I turned off the lamp, I swear I saw the faintest shimmer in the dark. A heat wave that had learned to move like a body. I left the studio without locking it. In the weeks that followed, commissions multiplied again. Galleries called, collectors begged. Every tragedy had my address on it. The dead were good business. I signed contracts with trembling hands, but I signed them all. Clémence watched me from across her wine glass one night. "You've started speaking like them," she said. "Like who?" "The ones you sculpt." I laughed it off. "Maybe they've started listening." She didn't laugh. Later that night, as she slept, I sat beside her and stared at her hand resting on my chest. It was warm. Living warm. And I realized I had forgotten what that felt like. At dawn, I returned to the studio and began sculpting her. Not from ashes, not yet. From memory. The curve of her wrist, the slope of her shoulder. I wanted to prove I could still make beauty from life. But it felt hollow. Without the dead, the clay was mute. That frightened me more than anything. I began recording voice memos as I worked, small notes to myself. Day 142. Clay batch C5. Tone improved with higher ash ratio. Surface reacts to temperature changes. Feels almost organic. Day 151. Sculptures cool too slowly. Suggest adjusting mix. Or maybe the mix adjusts me. Day 160. Dreamed of my mother. She was washing her hands in gray water. She said, "Stop feeding the fire." I kept those recordings locked away. If anyone heard them, they'd think I was insane. But part of me wanted to be caught. Artists are addicts of attention, even when it means exposure. The critics adored my emotional precision. They said my work revealed human fragility. I wanted to scream, "No, it hides it." But applause is narcotic. It numbs you softly. The Louvre invited me to exhibit in a private showcase. Legacy in matter, they called it. I knew the irony before they did. The night of the opening, I wore black gloves to hide the fine gray residue on my fingers. Clémence accompanied me, dressed like guilt dressed for church. The statues stood in perfect silence, 20 of them, each luminous, each holding someone's secret. When the lights dimmed for the unveiling, I felt the temperature shift. Not from the crowd, from the sculptures themselves. The air warmed subtly, like breath spreading. A journalist whispered, "They're alive." I smiled for the cameras, but behind the flash, I heard something else. A faint chorus of sighs, one for every piece I had ever fired. Afterward, as the crowd thinned, I walked alone among them. I could feel it in my chest, a synchronization, as though every sculpture had a heartbeat and they were all finding the same rhythm. Mine. I began to work feverishly. Nights bled into mornings, coffee into wine, sin into ritual. When I wasn't sculpting, I touched the finished ones. Not sexually, not reverently, but with the hunger of someone begging for proof. Proof that I hadn't imagined their warmth, their breath, their almost human pulse. Sometimes I whispered apologies. Sometimes I whispered names. I think they whispered back. Clemence stopped coming by. She said the studio felt crowded. I told her she was being dramatic. Then, one night, I heard her scream. She had entered the studio while I was asleep in the back room. The lights were dim, the statues lined along the walls. She said one moved. When I ran out, she was trembling, pointing. "They looked at me," she said. I turned toward the nearest sculpture, one of Arnaud's wife, and for a moment, I thought I saw condensation again. But this time, it wasn't from the air. "Leave," I told Clemence. She did, and never came back. I was alone with them now. The warmth grew stronger, more insistent. When I touched the marble, it pulsed faintly, a reminder or a warning. I couldn't tell. One night, drunk and sleepless, I decided to test it. I placed my hand over the heart of the newest piece, a young man sculpted from his own ashes, requested by a grieving mother. The clay radiated warmth that seeped into my palm, then my arm. My pulse slowed to match its rhythm. For a few seconds, I couldn't tell whose heartbeat was whose. It was ecstasy, it was terror, it was truth. In that moment, I understood. I hadn't been preserving the dead. I'd been trading pieces of myself for them. Each sculpture took a fragment, breath, warmth, memory. They were living, but only because I was dying into them. And still, I couldn't stop. I kept sculpting until my nails split, until my hands blistered, until my reflection looked more like dust than skin. When the last commission arrived, a self-portrait, requested by the museum itself, I laughed until my throat ached. They wanted me to sculpt me. Perfect. I'd already been doing that, just in pieces. That winter, the furnace burned for 7 days straight. The neighbors complained about the heat, said it smelled like incense. When the final statue cooled, I touched its face and felt a pulse stronger than my own. The kiln went out, and in the silence that followed, I realized I no longer felt warm. When the warmth left my hands, I told myself it was exhaustion. Artists run cold when the work ends. But this wasn't fatigue, it was absence. My fingers had turned pale, veins shadowing the skin like lines drawn by something deeper. The studio air was colder than before, though the furnace glowed red. The last sculpture, my self-portrait, stood in the center. It was my height, my posture, my hands half open as if begging or offering. I had mixed into it the residue of every previous commission, a fusion of all that remained, patrons, lovers, strangers. It was me and not me, a museum of sins molded into flesh-colored stone. When I stared at it too long, the sculpture seemed to breathe slower than I did, as if conserving the air we shared. and for the first time, I felt afraid of what I'd created, not because it lived, but because it no longer needed me. The studio became a tomb for its own maker. The kiln, once an altar, cooled to stone. The smell of fire lingered, but there was no heat left in the room. I stopped receiving commissions. People said my work had become too heavy, too disturbing. They were right. The pieces had started to crack from the inside, hairline fractures like veins through porcelain. When touched, they felt faintly alive, warm one moment, cold the next. Collectors returned their purchases. One sent a note. At night, it hums. We can't sleep. Another returned a sculpture wrapped in blankets, as if protecting it from something unseen. Inside, I found my own signature smudged, the base scorched. When I broke it open, the inside was hollow, not empty, but filled with black ash. Not the original mixture, something newer, something that smelled like burnt breath. That night, I dreamed the kiln was whispering, not in French, but in the wordless sound clay makes when it cools too fast, a crack that isn't heard, only felt. Delphine came back after 2 years. She looked thin, her hands trembling as she held a candle in the doorway. "He's gone again," she said quietly. "The sculpture." I woke up and it wasn't there. I wanted to tell her she was mistaken, that people misplace grief. But her eyes, they were the same eyes that had watched me the day we first touched her husband's ashes. Only now they were hollow, a kind of absence pretending to see. "Come in," I said, though my voice cracked. She walked to the center of the room, to my self-portrait. The candle flame wavered. "It's him," she whispered. "That warmth. It's his." I couldn't speak. The air grew heavier. The candle sputtered and went out. When I relit it, the sculpture's face had changed. Subtle, but real. The mouth now half open, as though caught mid-breath. Delphine wept. I fell to my knees. I no longer knew whose soul was trapped inside which body. I stopped sleeping. The city noises faded into murmurs that blended with the statue's silence. I began to hear the faint rhythm again, the pulse that once lived in their marble. Only now it came from me. Slow, uneven, as if something was sharing it. Every mirror betrayed me. My reflection flickered, the color of my skin graying in places, fingertips dusted in fine powder that wouldn't wash away. I remembered what Clémence had said. "You've started speaking like them." Maybe she was right. Maybe I had become fluent in a language not meant for the living. It happened at dawn. The self-portrait cracked with a sound like bone. The head tilted forward slightly. The air filled with a dry wind, though every window was shut. I stepped closer. Dust fell from the fracture line and landed on my wrist. Warm. I lifted my hand, trembling, weightless, and placed it against the sculpture's chest. It was colder than death. Then, beneath the marble, something shifted. A faint thump. Then another. Heartbeat. Mine or its, I couldn't tell. I pressed harder, desperate, terrified. The marble split open at the center, revealing a cavity inside. Black dust swirling, alive, restless. It moved toward me, drawn by breath or guilt. When it touched my face, I screamed. It entered like air does when you're drowning and mistake suffocation for salvation. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor. The sculpture stood unbroken again. My chest burned, but my skin was cold. I crawled to the mirror. My eyes were gray. Days later, Clémence returned. She found me collapsed beside the kiln, surrounded by shards of the self-portrait. Police said it was a studio fire, though nothing burned. They carried out 20 sculptures, each warm to the touch. though the room had been cold for days. At the funeral, they insisted on one. Clémence said I looked peaceful. She donated my tools to an art school. She kept nothing except one piece, a small sculpture of intertwined hands labeled only E.L. Weeks later, she told a friend it was warm. I wish I could tell you that the story ends there, that I died and the statues cooled. But the truth is quieter, stranger. In the Louvre basement, where temperature is controlled and light never touches the marble, the curator noticed something. The humidity sensor near my last piece kept reading higher than normal. When they adjusted it, the sculpture's surface fogged faintly, as if breathing. They sealed the room, but every month the warmth returned. No one knows why. Some say it's trapped heat from the firing process. Some say it's chemistry, or myth, or madness. But I know better. The warmth never belonged to the clay. It belonged to the guilt that made it live. And guilt, like art, never truly dies. It just hardens, waiting for touch. Silence has weight. When you live long enough inside it, it stops being absence and becomes architecture. A room you cannot leave because it was built from everything you refused to say. I used to think confession was for the weak, that art was the confession, that every chisel mark, every indentation, every tremor of my hand had already told the truth for me. But when you sculpt the dead long enough, you start realizing they remember silence better than speech. Now I speak to you from a place without echo. Some call it purgatory, some memory. I call it the room of unfinished things. After my death, or disappearance, the word depends on who you ask. A young curator began cataloging my works for restoration. His name was Julian, barely 30, eyes untainted by grief. He approached the self-portrait first, unaware of what it held. He wrote in his notes, "Surface temperature anomalous. Sculpture emits faint hum near the chest cavity." I watched him from wherever I was, perhaps inside the marble, perhaps nowhere, as he leaned closer, pressing his ear against the stone. His breath fogged the surface. The sculpture answered, a whisper too low to capture, too personal to mistake. He recoiled, dropped his notebook, then, trembling, whispered, "Who are you?" And for the first time in years, or deaths, I found words. The man who mistook warmth for love. The whisper echoed inside both of us. His heart raced. Mine didn't. They say punishment fits the crime, but that's only true in stories. In life, punishment becomes the mirror. Endless, exact, unblinking. Mine is made of memory. I see every face I molded, not as statues now, but as moments I stole. Delphine's trembling hand. The child who never grew older than 5. The lovers who wanted eternity and got it too literally. My parents, who only ever wanted me to make something useful. They visit me one by one, emerging from the marble fog that surrounds this place. Their forms are perfect, too perfect. Not living, not dead, preserved. Each speaks with the same voice. Why couldn't you let us rest? I want to say I loved them, that I wanted to keep them near, that art is the only language I knew for devotion. But love becomes cruelty when it refuses to end. And I never let anything end. In the dark, I lift my hands. They are not flesh anymore. They shimmer like translucent clay, veins glowing faintly from within. I can see fingerprints, but they no longer belong to me. Each ridge holds someone else's story. This is the cost of preservation. Every touch writes a new guilt. I reach toward the nearest sculpture, one of my own making. Its eyes are closed, serene, familiar. I realize it's not one of the dead. It's me, again, another version, sculpted from the moments I tried to forget. He opens his eyes and speaks. You thought permanence was mercy, but permanence is hell. The words strike like a chisel blow. Cracks spread through my reflection. Each fracture reveals a memory. The first ash mixed with clay. The warmth beneath Delphine's touch. The applause. The lie. Why did you need us to breathe? Because I couldn't, I whisper. The mirror smiles sadly. Now you'll remember what breath costs. He steps forward, merging with me. For a second, we are both whole, creator and creation, sinner and saint. Then the world collapses into white dust. When I wake, I am standing in a vast hall. No ceiling, no floor, only suspended sculptures. My life's work floating in pale light. Each one hums softly, their warmth radiating in waves. A voice, neither male nor female, speaks from everywhere. You sought immortality through others' ends. Did you succeed? I preserved them, I answer, though the words feel hollow. No, you paused them. There is a difference. I gave them form. I gave grief a shape. And in doing so, you denied it peace. The hall trembles. Dust rises from nowhere, glowing like slow lightning. Do you wish to repent? I think of Delphine, of Clémence, of the warmth in the statues, of the silence that followed each applause. I wish, I whisper, to let them go. Then begin. The sculptures start to fracture, gently at first, like exhaling stone. Each piece crumbles into ash, rising upward like smoke. The hall fills with shimmering particles, each spark carrying a memory I had stolen. Faces form and fade. Laughter dissolves into silence. Heat becomes light. When the last statue vanishes, the air cools. My hands return to flesh, scarred, trembling, human. Months later, Julian, the curator, discovered a note hidden inside the hollow of my final piece. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded, but the words remained legible. Art is not how we preserve the dead. It's how we forgive ourselves for surviving them. He placed the note in the museum archive. They labeled it unverified, unsure whether it was truly mine. But I remember writing it, or maybe wanting to. Either way, it was enough. I have one confession left. I never believed in ghosts, not until I became one. Not the kind that haunts, but the kind that lingers in fingerprints, in unfinished works, in the warmth that refuses to fade. When I think of those I sculpted, I hope they forgive the touch that turned them into myth. I hope they know I meant to honor them, even when I failed. And if one day you stand before one of my pieces, in a museum or in a private room or in some forgotten warehouse, and you feel warmth under your hand, don't be afraid. It isn't the dead you feel. It's what's left of the living. Learning, at last, how to let go. The world remembers me as a scandal, a whisper in art history lectures, the sculptor who used ashes, the man who gave warmth to marble. But names are softer than they sound when no one speaks them anymore. I live only in the breath of strangers standing before what remains of my work, and that is enough. Forgiveness, I have learned, doesn't arrive like a verdict. It grows quietly, the way clay dries, slow, uneven, leaving traces of hands that once shaped it. Years passed. The Louvre sealed my final exhibit behind glass, not for fame, but for containment. Visitors come and go. Some linger too long. Some claim they feel heat under their palms. The guards dismiss it as myth, but they still keep the room cooler than the rest. Julian, the curator who once heard the whisper, now oversees restoration for others' works. He never married. Sometimes, late at night, he speaks to my statue as if to an old friend. "You're quieter now," he says. "Good," I answer, though he never hears. It comforts me to know someone still listens, even to silence. My story, as mortals tell it, ends in Paris. But the ashes, not the ones I used, the ones that were mine, were sent to Limoges at my parents' request. They were buried behind the old kiln yard where porcelain dust still glitters in the dirt. Children walk past that spot on their way to school. Sometimes they pause and scoop a handful of the pale soil, shaping it into small hearts, faces, bowls. They leave them on the windowsills to dry. They don't know what that patch of earth remembers, and I pray they never do. When the sun hits those little figures, they glow faintly, just enough for someone to notice and smile. That is what art should have been. Warmth without possession. If there is a heaven for artists, it must be made of all the mistakes they tried to hide. Rooms filled with unfinished sketches, cracked statues, unbaked clay. Everything that never reached perfection, because perfection kills what it touches. I imagine walking there now, my hands stained, my heart unarmed. I touch each broken piece and feel gratitude instead of guilt. Each fracture a forgiveness I never asked for. I kneel beside the smallest sculpture, the first one that breathed, and whisper, "You may rest now." The silence answers, not with warmth, but with peace. They say the dead cannot create, but that is not true. We build memory in the minds of the living, shape echoes that outlast marble. One night, in a dream, or perhaps in the mind of someone remembering me, I find myself back in the studio. The table is clean. The tools are arranged neatly. There is only one lump of clay waiting. I place my hands on it. It's cool, honest, untouched. No ashes, no history, just possibility. I press gently, letting it take shape on its own. The clay resists, then yields, forming a small vessel, humble, imperfect, human. For the first time, I feel no need to fire it, to immortalize it. It is enough that it exists, soft and fragile, breathing air like a living thing. I leave it unfinished. Clémence returns to the museum once each year. She never tells anyone why. She walks past the marble saints, the gilded gods, the ancient relics, until she reaches the sealed room. There, in the faint reflection of the glass, she sees me. Not the man she once knew, not the sinner, not the genius, just the craftsman who forgot that beauty needs endings. She places her hand on the glass. The warmth meets her palm, and for a moment, we share the same pulse again. Not as punishment, but as closure. She smiles through tears. "Rest now, Émile," she whispers. "You've made enough." The light flickers once, like the kiln remembering fire. Then stillness. Art begins where control ends. I spent a lifetime sculpting permanence from decay, trying to make beauty hold its breath forever. I mistook stillness for salvation. Now I understand. Creation is not about preserving life. It's about releasing it. Warmth does not belong to the clay. It belongs to the touch that dares to let go. If you ever feel that warmth under your hand, know this. It isn't a ghost. It's a promise that even from ashes, love can learn to forgive itself.